Welcome everyone, and now I can't see because of the glare. On behalf of Suzanne, Colby, I'd like to give a huge thank you to everyone for attending today, showing up, and really being supportive of SRNT. This presidential symposium meant a lot to Suzanne because youth cessation has been a passion of hers for the last 2 decades, and Suzanne has been one of the leaders in the field early on, calling for us to not neglect that as an important issue, for thinking through a lot of the methodological challenges that come with the really hard work of trying to get youth and young adults to stop using tobacco. And she has been one of the premier researchers in the area for the last 2 decades, continuing to remind us about the importance and not to forget about youth cessation. So the symposium was really a great way for her to cap off her presidential year, and we're sorry that she's unable to be here, but we're going to continue and really do this as a way of honoring her and thanking everyone for attending as well. So I have a couple of housekeeping announcements just to make to start with. First is to make sure you've downloaded the SRNT app, which gives you all the guidance about the meeting. What's really important is that the app is frequently updated. So should we know if some sessions are being streamed or WebEx instead of or in person, you can find out immediately and not be surprised. So please, keep checking your app and showing, yeah, it's updated hourly, which is amazing and which is great. We also really have been appreciative of everybody's consideration of everyone else and the health and safety, and we've seen all kinds of good practices and keep them up, including the nice distance that everyone seems to have from each other here, which is great. But somewhat contrary to that, I do also want to remind you and invite you to the SRNT opening reception up on the 3rd floor immediately following the symposium this afternoon. So please take advantage of the opportunity to network, to say hello to colleagues, and enjoy the hospitality here of New Orleans. So I'm Robin Mermelstein. I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm going to play several different roles here this afternoon, standing in for other people as well. So Suchitra and I are going to split the symposium. We'll be alternating back and forth. We are going to try to hold questions until the end of all the presentations rather than in between, just to get a greater discussion going, and hopefully that they will flow into each other. So we're going to start with the first symposium, which is really an update on what is going on with adolescent tobacco use across the board. And I'm filling in for Ahmed Jamal, whose presentation this is from Ahmed and his colleagues at the CDC. So hopefully it will go smoothly as I'm going to present his data. So just, one of the nice things that other people, not me, do is they tell you what they're going to talk about in a nice organized fashion. So just to give you a sense of what his talk is about, we're going to go through first the tobacco product landscape. What are the systems that we have in place for tracking youth behavior, what those behaviors are, how do they escalate to dependence and cessation, what does the healthcare system do in terms of advice to quit, and then end up with some of the key takeaways from this. So we're going to start with just looking at what do we know, what's the latest data that we have. So let's just start with a reminder that for this audience, everyone knows these are not the same old products of a couple of decades ago. That tobacco product landscape continues to evolve tremendously, and especially for youth cessation. So among tobacco products, we have a variety of not just your traditional cigarettes, but we have a variety of other combustibles and certainly non-combustibles, the most recent of which are heated tobacco products, e-cigarettes, and certainly some dissolvables. So when we start to think about some of the data and what the needs are among adolescents, we really need to consider the totality of what are the options that youth have for using tobacco. Even more complicated has been the evolution of e-cigarettes across multiple generations. We started with the first generation of e-cigs, which were the more cig-alikes, disposables, moved to things like vape pens and tank systems. And now, which is what we know, is that most youth use the fourth generation pod devices, which also tend to have nicotine salts and are a higher concentration and higher delivery of nicotine. So by far, fourth generation e-cigarettes are the most prevalent that kids use these days. There are a variety of really nice surveillance systems. We heard a little bit from our FDA colleagues about the importance of surveillance and especially post-market surveillance. And so data in this presentation are going to come from 3 primary sources. What we're most familiar with perhaps is the National Youth Tobacco Survey, and the data I'll be showing here is going to rely heavily on that. That is an annual US survey of middle and high school kids, so it is a school-based survey. And it has a variety of indicators in there that are useful for thinking about cessation, not just actual behavior, but kids' interest in quitting, some signs and signals of dependence, and self-report on whether kids have been screened. The National Ambulatory Medical Care Survey is based on office-based practices for physicians and healthcare providers. So there, again, it's a national probability sample within those offices, and we get nice data from that about healthcare visits and utilization. And then to have a more international perspective, the data here will rely on the Global Youth Tobacco Survey, which is again a school-based throughout numerous countries across the world. And again, it also has some data on do youth want to quit. So what we see, we're going to start with the US data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey, and really some striking things to look at. And these are data from 2011 to 2019, so the most recent 2019 data. Just a quick methodological note, because you're wondering what the dotted line might be, and that is just that the mode of assessment switched from paper and pencil to electronic. So because there's a change in the way the data are collected, we can't necessarily assume that those are continuous trend lines, that there may be some methodological differences in there, accounting perhaps for some of the longitudinal changes. So, but if we look, and if we, some of the striking things to think about, back in, less than a decade ago, in 2011, cigarettes were by far the most common tobacco product ever used. Now these are data high school students ever use. That means, have you ever in your life used a product? And in 2011, almost 40% of high school students had tried a cigarette. And obviously then, the rates of e-cig use were quite low. Cigars were the second most, and cigars includes little cigars, cigarillos. That's a broad-based category. 2014, things changed dramatically, and so we see for the first time, between 2014 and 2015, e-cigarettes take over as the most common tobacco product used. And then we see the continual climb in e-cigarette use rates of ever trying among high school students. So in 2019, the most recent data, almost 47% basically, of high school kids report ever having tried an e-cig, which is a phenomenally high rate. The success, of course, is that cigarette rates have continued to decline and have declined dramatically. But I also just want to remind you that there are a couple of other important points here. Please keep note of that cigar rate, because that's right there with cigarettes and with adolescents, and we need to remember that as well. So for middle school kids, the data look very similar other than the rates are much lower. But the trends and the patterns look the same, where we see the enormous change happening about the same time in the shift to prevalence of e-cigarettes being more common, cigarettes dropping, and of course cigars being second most common. So same exact pattern of ever use. Current use is defined of in the past 30 days, and this tends to be how among youth we think about, is somebody a user at the moment of a tobacco product. It's usually defined as by considering the past 30 days. And here again, the trend for e-cigarette use being in the past 30 days, 27.5% of high school students report currently using an e-cigarette. And cigarettes have dropped, but cigars now are slightly higher. So again, when we're thinking about combustible use, with adolescents, you really got to think about both. Not just cigarettes, but all combustible products that are in there. And certainly cigarettes and cigar-like products are important to consider. Current use for middle school students, same patterns that we're seeing. And similarly, here cigars and cigarettes are right there neck and neck, but e-cigarette is really the story for current use. This slide is super important to think about because what this slide shows are a couple of things. So let's talk about use of any tobacco product, focusing on the overall, the far left-hand slide. So considering middle and high school together, 23% of youth are using any tobacco product right now. And these are current cigarette users, currently defined. Now, combustible is called out here, which is 8.8% overall. And the reason for thinking about combustible is by far we know, and certainly Matt Holman presented these data, if we think about a continuum of risk, combustible tobacco products are by far where the greatest harm is. So we really do want the laser focus on combustible tobacco products. It's okay. It goes off, it's okay. I can't see anything with the glare. But what I really want, and then so those figures then are broken down into high school and middle school. But the important thing I want you to think about is that a third, the green bar, of current tobacco users actually are using 2 or more products. So in the past month, a third across the board, whether it's overall, high school, or middle school students, don't just use one product, but they're using 2 or more products. So dual use, however we want to define that dual use, meaning in the past month they've used more than one type of product, is really quite common. And when we look at what those combinations of products are, it's usually that kids are using e-cigarettes plus another, and often that is plus cigars, which is the most common one, or e-cigarettes and cigarettes. But it's really quite striking that e-cigarettes and cigars are the most common dual-use product among adolescents. So I think these data are incredibly important for us to think about, because when we talk about adolescent cessation and what the implications for what our targets are and our behaviors, we really need to consider these combos of products and what people are doing. It's not a single product landscape anymore. Globally, so what we see, and this may be a bit of a challenging slide to figure out. So these are data from the Global Youth Tobacco Survey. It's 130 countries get surveyed, and these are data that show between 2008 and 2014. So think about these data are slightly before the e-cig really increases that we saw, like in the US. So current tobacco use among all students who from 13 to 15 years of age had a low of 3.2% in Kazakhstan to 43.3% in the Federated States of Micronesia. But overall, globally, the median was 16.6%. And now, if we look at use of e-cigarettes from 2012 to 2015, again, before a large e-cigarette global and the world and the landscape changed, these are even harder to read, but from my memory is Kazakhstan also has the lowest percentage of 1.6%. And then the UNRWA, which is United Nations Regional, whatever that's, like it's a Gaza Strip in there, have a highest rate of 15.4%. It ranges across the countries. If we look at, again, the current tobacco use, again, 2000 to 2015, the other important thing is these regionally, there are important gender differences. So we have a high for males in Southeast Asia of 20.9% of males 13 to 15-year-olds are current tobacco users. This is through 2015. In females, you always have a much lower rate, but the highest rate for female is in the European region. So what do we know about dependence and cessation? These are also really interesting data. These are now back to 2019 US, the National Youth Tobacco Survey data. So the two questions that we'll focus on, the first is, do kids report at all that they've had a craving to use a tobacco product, a strong craving, in the last 30 days? So this is of current users. So overall, about a quarter, a little bit more, perhaps, of kids are reporting who are current users that they've experienced a strong craving to use. Slightly interesting, more females than males. There are some ethnic differences, and obviously it's age dependent with more high school than middle school kids reporting. A second indicator of dependence is always how soon after waking do you use a product, a tobacco product. And so these also are significant numbers, with overall about 13.7% of kids report using tobacco products within 30 minutes of waking. And there are important differences. Males use more quickly in the morning than females. Non-Hispanic whites more frequently than Hispanic, and then obviously high school kids as well. What's interesting is the very large percentage, a majority of kids report that they're seriously thinking about quitting. Overall, 57.8% report, and this is pretty consistent. There aren't hugely striking differences across different subgroups. That means that they're currently thinking among current tobacco users about quitting, and a good number have actually tried made a serious 24-hour quit attempt, have tried to, on purpose, not try to use a tobacco product for 24 hours. Again, more than half of them have reported that. So kids are interested in stopping their use. Similarly, in terms of desire to quit, globally, this ranges across the board. A really high in Philippines of 90%, for whatever reason, of the youth there want to quit. And Uruguay has a low of 32%. But I think overall, in the US and globally, kids actually are interested in quitting. So one thing that we know is that healthcare systems and healthcare providers are often good vehicles to screen and to recommend. So this is now data that is self-reported data, because it's the NYTS data in 2015. So this is now a few years ago. Self-reported, from the kids asking about, were you screened, and then did you receive advice? So, there the kids report overall that maybe only 36.6% were screened. It goes up in high school, and 27% received advice. Again, it's self-report. Kids may not always know or be good reporters, but nevertheless, it shows that there's plenty of room for improvement here. When we look at data from the NAMCS, which is the National Ambulatory Care Survey, so this is looking at physician office visits and reports from that, so it's a different data source. We see that rates of screening are much higher, documentation of them in the medical record, and of those, that they actually document about 3% of visits are documented users, and then that they document about 22% receive advice, and it increases with a little bit with age. More recently, in 2016, screening looked like it increased to 81.4%, so perhaps we're seeing some good trends, and of those confirmed tobacco users of, again, still 3% of physician office visits. So things to think about. We all know the tobacco landscape is more and more complex. Thinking about stopping tobacco products requires considering those changes and what new products are coming on the market as we speak. A lot of kids are using some form of tobacco now. More than 1 in 3 have used 2 or more products of those who've tried anything. So the rates of ever use are high. The current use rates are pretty high. But of those who are using, the kids actually are thinking about quitting seriously. At least half, which is tremendous in the sense that there's a need and a demand to help them quit. And healthcare providers are still a good vehicle for providing advice, but there's plenty of room to screen and provide assistance. So those are takeaways. I think we're going to wait to take questions at the end, since I am not Ahmed, to answer some really technical ones if you have. However, he would more than welcome your contacting him if you have a specific question about any of these data or the surveys. His email is on there. So we're going to transition now to introduce Suchitra, who's going to give us an overview of what we know about adolescent cessation interventions. This you need. Yeah. This is just
So before I get started, I want us to give Robin a resounding applause. It's hard enough to give your own talk and to give somebody else's talk. So. It's the other presentation, not this one. There's a third one. Yeah, you know, as I said, it's hard enough to give your own presentation than give someone else's presentation, so that was pretty amazing. Okay, so as Robin said, this was really Suzanne's baby, and she wanted me to talk about cessation and what we knew about youth smoking cessation and how we could use some of that knowledge to actually develop interventions for other tobacco products. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of youth smoking cessation, what's worked, you know, what's not worked. And then I'm going to use e-cigarettes as an example to give you information on how we might think about developing interventions for youth. Now, these same principles could be applied to the cigar use rates that Robin just pointed out to you is going up tremendously amongst youth also. So I think there's so much work to be done in this area, and I hope our slides will convey that. So my talk is going to cover 3 components. First, what do we know about youth smoking cessation? Then I'm going to move in, as I told you, to tell you a little bit about what drives youth appeal for e-cigarettes. Why do kids like e-cigarettes? How can we use that information to develop interventions for them? And finally, what do we know about developing cessation interventions for youth e-cigarette use? You know, we need to do a lot of, I feel, developmental work in this area before we can go down that path. And many groups are doing work in this area, which is so wonderful to see. So I will give you a little glimpse into what our group has been doing in this area. So, youth smoking cessation. Well, this slide conveys it all. I know it's very busy, but I figured you would all want all the information on one slide. Different types of modalities have been tried with youth for smoking cessation. They have used the 5 A's, which are the clinician-based interventions about ask, advise, assist, and arrange. I'm sure you're all very familiar with these. They have tried cognitive behavioral therapy, which involves goal setting, self-monitoring, cognitive reframing, and teaching coping skills. There has been some success with motivational interviews or enhancement, and Suzanne, who's not here today, has done a lot of this work, addressing resistance with confrontation, strengthening desire to quit, and reducing ambivalence about quitting. A lot of interventions have been based on the trans-theoretical model of change, which really, for those of you who know, really focuses on identifying the stage of change that the individual is in. And these range from pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And then behavior change is facilitated within each of these stages using motivational enhancement interventions. There have been a few trials with pharmacological interventions, nicotine patch and inhaler, bupropion and varenicline. And there have been a lot of novel interventions which have been tried, which are listed at the bottom of that slide. The bottom novel interventions have mostly been very small trials. So that is one of the concerns with drawing any conclusions from them. From a treatment setting perspective, and this will become a little more clear why this is important when I move to the e-cigarette area, a number of different interventional settings have been tried with youth. Schools have been a big focus of a lot of the work that has been done. Now, schools are really ideal for accessing youth and conveying information to youth. They are great from a prevention and education perspective. One of the problems with doing cessation interventions in schools that we have run into is confidentiality and how the parent needs to be involved in the intervention. So this always raises concerns because a lot of kids will say, I do not want to participate if my parent has to be involved in the intervention. So that is one concern. And then there is the issue of confidentiality. If someone is participating in an intervention and the school knows they're participating in an intervention, will they be isolated in some way for any kind of penalties? So this is a huge concern that came up when we were developing some marijuana-based interventions in schools, where kids were afraid that if they participated in the intervention, they would be identified and targeted for locker checkups because people knew that they were in a marijuana cessation program. So confidentiality is a big issue in schools, and you really have to work with the school to develop parameters that cover confidentiality issues and don't put the kids at risk. Healthcare setting is another, as Robin mentioned, a great opportunity for a teaching moment when they are with their pediatricians and primary care physicians. And believe me, kids listen to their pediatricians, even though they may make a big noise about it, they really do. And I think this is a great opportunity to provide interventions. Unfortunately, lack of provider time and lack of follow-up does not allow most clinicians, even though they might be very well-meaning, to do anything more than the ask, advise, assist, and refer. They really can't do anything more beyond that. And we really need to take, use this opportunity and try to develop interventions which take advantage of these settings. And then internet and mobile phones. This is something that has just grown over the past, I would say 10 years or so. People are using social media, using Facebook, all kinds of things to reach out to kids. They are using mobile phones to reach out to kids. I think many of these interventions are wonderful, and they are great at motivating kids and getting them engaged. I think what we need to see is, while the reach is great, how effective they are. I think these kinds of programs can be used very effectively to develop prevention interventions. Their utility in cessation interventions is still growing, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. To give you a little bit of bad news, this is a Cochrane review that came out on adolescent smoking outcomes, and many of you may have seen this. This was published in 2017. They took all the studies and they reviewed some really good studies which had been done and asked the question, how did they do? And you can see here, when I say bad news, you can just look at the odds ratios which are listed on this slide, which essentially tells you that not too many did very well when you compared them to the control condition. There is group counseling had a risk ratio of 1.35. Individual counseling had risk ratio of 1.07. Some mixed delivery methods which used computer or messaging interventions had even worse outcomes. Nicotine replacement therapy, there were 3 trials when this review was published, did not do that well with youth. And that's another issue of concern. And there was one study with bupropion where the odds ratio was 1.5. Again, not what you see in adults. So this is what I really want to emphasize here. Let's please remember that these are not adults. You cannot assume that whatever works for adults is going to work for youth. And that is, if there's any takeaway you get from this talk, I hope that's the message that's conveyed loudly and clearly. This is the Chantix trial. This is another example of that, which is, this, as some of you may know, was just published. they did not find any the abstinence outcomes of 7-day abstinence that is commonly used in most of these studies did not show any difference from the placebo condition, and you can see what the small number of kids who actually were able to quit in this study. So this was a very tough trial to run, and it took Pfizer. They put enormous amount of effort into it, and I say kudos to them for getting this done, but it was unfortunately a negative result. But there was, these are data from the same trial where they asked about self-reports of abstinence, and they asked kids, well, were you smoking or not? And this data does seem to suggest there is some benefit of the Chantix treatment for these kids. It's just that the primary outcome was not positive. So overall, the general conclusions of this Cochrane review and of this field in general are that most of the work that exists have been small trials with little to no follow-up and low quality of evidence, and really the balance between reach of the intervention and efficacy has been very hard to achieve. So my take home here is we need to do a lot more, even in smoking cessation. We need to do a lot more to develop to conduct large, well-powered clinical trials of both behavioral and pharmacological interventions for youth and young adults too, which I'm not talking about. We have very few really well-developed interventions for college-age smokers, which is, again, a huge concern. And these trials, interventions need to have reach and efficacy. Now, moving on to the other part, which is that most of this work has been done with cigarettes. We have been very few interventions that have really been focused on other tobacco products like cigars or e-cigarettes or hookah or smokeless tobacco, which are also used by kids. And there haven't been any well-powered clinical trials conducted in any of these other areas either. So I feel we have a lot of work to do, and what I'm going to show you a little bit about is how it's important to understand the appeal and cues related to products in order to develop better interventions. And as I said, I'm using e-cigarettes as an example here. So what draws youth to e-cigarettes? I mean, you've all seen a lot of data on this issue. So when you're developing an intervention, you need to think about, okay, what do kids want to quit, which I'll cover in a bit. But secondly, if you're developing an intervention, what would you consider about, what would you need to know? So one of the first things that draws kids to e-cigarettes is multiple innovative devices. We have a marketplace that is just evolving, and you saw some of the pictures now. Most recently, they have these, to kind of get over the flavor ban, you get these crush capsules, almost like the menthol crush capsules that you can put onto your e-cigarette and still get the flavor, even though the product itself may not contain a flavor in it. So the products evolve daily. And as researchers, to tell you the truth, we've had a very hard time even keeping up with the assessment of these products because of the constantly changing landscape of these products. The other thing to keep in mind is youth are using multiple devices. So when you're developing interventions, don't assume that if somebody just brings one device and shows you that's the only device they're using. They're going to be using all kinds of different devices, hookah pen, Juul, mods, disposables, all kinds of different things. So you have to ask and assess, and when you're advising kids on what to quit, you have to focus on everything, not just on a single device, because then they'll just use the other one, and that kind of defeats the purpose. Youth love the customizable product features of e-cigarettes, and this is very important because they love the different flavors, they love that they can change the temperature, change the voltage, and I don't know if Tom Eisenberg is in the audience here, but his group has very nicely shown that all these different features, like changing voltage, changing temperature, can change how much you can deliver from the e-cigarettes. So you can get more nicotine, you can get more flavors. It really can change what your experience is. So I think these are, again, things to be taken into consideration when you're developing an intervention. We know they have over 15,000 flavors, and or maybe even more. And this was initial work that came out which suggested that youth really believe that ads for flavored e-liquids target individuals their age and not older adults. So if you ask a kid, why do you use these products? They'll say, that's because these flavors are for us. I don't know any older adults who use these flavors. So I think to address that perception during your intervention is also an important issue, because we know that even exposure to the flavors alone may not be that safe, but the data on that is still emerging. This is some evidence that we had on what kind of flavors are used by youth, and you can see that the top flavor that's liked the most by all kids are fruit flavors, and this is followed by the mint flavors, and then a wide variability in terms of all the other flavors. So addressing flavors in your intervention is a very important issue, and here's why. And I know this is a topic of big discussion in the US and elsewhere. This is data that we have, that we've published, where we looked at flavors used by youth versus adults in e-cigarettes. And yes, adults used flavors and youth used flavors too. However, when you looked at how the total number of flavors related to e-cigarette use frequency, you only found a relationship amongst youth and not adults. So the more flavors youth used, the more e-cigarettes they used. So there's a direct connection there. And you cannot develop an intervention without addressing this issue with kids. The next point to remember is nicotine and addiction. When Juul products and the products first came out, when the products were first in the market, many kids did not know if they contain nicotine or not. But this is data that we got from surveys, longitudinal surveys we are doing in Connecticut, where we asked kids about whether they had used nicotine in their e-cigarettes. And kids who use Juul, you can see in the third bar, very clearly most of them know that Juuls contain nicotine. And there's wide variability in whether they are using nicotine in their other products or not. This is some more recent data we have on why youth like Juul, and the point I want to make here is, if you look at, we assessed a number of different issues of why youth might like Juul, including pharmacological effects, which is the first set of questions you see, then product characteristics, pharmacological effects like getting a buzz, helping me concentrate, and so on and so forth, product characteristics like liking flavors and a variety of other things, social reasons like friends using, and then some other reasons you see listed there, including ability to conceal from parents and from teachers. Now, the reason I'm showing you this data is to just focus on the left-hand side, which is what concerns me. Significant proportion of the kids who are current Juul users said that they use the product for the buzz. Now, which means that they are very familiar with what buzz is, what it is doing to them, and there's a very high possibility that these kids could be dependent or addicted to nicotine if they are using it primarily for the buzz. So again, this is something we need to assess. We don't know how dependent these kids are. We don't know if they experience withdrawal. We haven't done all this work, and we need to understand that in order to develop better interventions. In fact, the reasons for liking Juul among current Juul users, the top reason was it gives me a buzz, I like the flavors, and friends use it. And then when we looked at how these reasons for liking Juul related to frequency of use of Juul, it was really the pharmacological effects which came out on top. So, feeling the buzz came out on top. That was what was related to frequency of e-cigarette use. So this raises the question then, some of these kids may need nicotine replacement, may need things to deal with their dependence or withdrawal if indeed they experience these symptoms. So that's the reason I'm pointing this out to you, that we need to be thinking about what do we need to do, what do we not know, and how do we move forward in terms of what interventions might be best. The last thing that really draws kids to e-cigarettes, and this is something I still don't know how to handle in interventions, but we have to, is alternative behaviors. Things like dripping and things like vape tricks. You all know what vape tricks are. They are all over social media, but there are a lot of kids who just use e-cigarettes for vape tricks. Some of them may be occasional users, and maybe they'll be able to quit easily. But there are many kids who say they try vape tricks or use vape tricks almost regularly, and many who say they've also used dripping the e-liquid directly onto a heated coil and inhaling it for a better hit. The other one I do not, again, know how to deal with is vaping cannabis, which is huge. So we heard a lot today about, cessation, and we heard the FDA talk about how they are addressing cessation. But remember, they're addressing nicotine cessation, tobacco cessation. Nobody is targeting marijuana vaping. And it is this gray area that nobody is touching and nobody is working on. And most of the kids today are vaping cannabis and not, may not be vaping nicotine. I don't know this for sure. We are collecting this data, but a lot of kids are vaping cannabis. And one of the reasons, if you look at the devices, they look very similar to e-cigarettes. They are using devices that are either made for cannabis, and this is some data we have on how we've been monitoring the increase in vaping cannabis using e-cigarettes, and you can see that the rates of lifetime vaping have gone up significantly. Even if you just look at from 2014 to 2018, the rates have gone up tremendously since then. The blue bars is what I'm talking about there, 2014 and then 2019. And most recently, we asked kids, what devices are you using to vape marijuana or hashish? And they say, a lot of them say they use e-cigarettes, as you see in the left-hand side chart. But then we also specifically asked them, do you use marijuana-specific devices, or do you hack your e-cigarette devices? And you can see that there are 20.5% of kids who actually say they hack or modify the e-cigarette devices to use marijuana. So they're not just using marijuana devices, they are using devices that were made for something else, and they're hacking them to put marijuana in it. So again, how do you address this in an intervention? I don't know. We have to be very creative about this, I think, when you think about how you develop interventions for this. So the general conclusions are e-cigarette interventions for youth need to assess and address use of multiple devices, use of flavors, use of nicotine and development of addiction, use and adaptation of e-cigarettes for alternative use behaviors, and then use and adaptation of e-cigarettes for marijuana vaping. Now, in the last part of my talk, I'm going to address the issue of, do youth really want to quit using e-cigarettes? So this is a very good question. We saw some data from the NYTS, which suggests that they do. But adolescent substance users in general, and I've been working in this field for a long time, they are very difficult to engage and retain in treatment. They really are resistant to the concept of behavior change. They do not find the substance use to be problematic, and really fail to see the urgency in needing to quit. So the concept has always been that traditional prevention and cessation methods may not work that well for them. So you may really need to think outside the box. And I think this e-cigarette epidemic has kind of, really reinforced that thought process. Before we started down the path of developing interventions, this is unpublished data that we just got from 8 focus groups we did with 14 to 18-year-old regular e-cigarette users in high schools, where we asked them some of these questions. I mean, what do you ask? What do you need to know to develop good e-cigarette interventions? One of the major findings, which I was very happy to see, is that most teens wanted to quit, which is wonderful. I mean, which means you're already starting off at a level where they are thinking about quitting, and you don't actually have to convince them to quit, which is really great to see, because that's kind of half the battle. And you can see that in some of the comments that we got here. I'll read you one. I only know probably 1 or 2 people that didn't want to quit. Everyone is like, yeah, I would love to quit. So there's definitely interest in quitting amongst teens in high school. Some of the reasons they identified for quitting were things like health concerns, addiction, and how it was influencing their physical performance. Things like, I would wake up in the middle of the night coughing for like 10 minutes straight, or during sports, my breathing was worse and I could not participate in sports as well. So they are noticing these things, and they are noticing that their physical abilities are changing, and they really want to quit, and they're very concerned about addiction too. When we asked them about barriers to quitting, addiction came up a lot. They said that it's very hard to quit. I don't even like using it, but it's just the fact that I fiend for it. I did not know what fiend meant till I started seeing all these. I guess my vocabulary is kind of, in the back burner somewhere. But anyway, they really wanted the nicotine cravings. And the other thing that was, they really said was a barrier to quitting was friends who use. And the other thing that was raised by a lot of kids is the overprevalence of vaping in high schools. So they all said that even if I quit by myself at home, cold turkey, I go back to school and I see all these kids vaping. And that serves as a cue for me to start vaping again. So this goes back to my point about how we really need to do something about vaping in schools, because that is a huge barrier to kids quitting. Very few had tried other interventions. Some said they had tried NRT, but it didn't do anything for them. And some others reported trying some other methods, but it not being effective. We asked them, what are the desired characteristics of a quit vaping program? What would you really want to see? They really wanted the freedom to choose to quit. They did not want it to be mandatory quitting. This was very important to them. So they did not want to be mandated by anybody to quit. And that kind of ties into the use of counselors from outside the school, because they felt that if you used people who are in the school, they may actually tie into other programs within the school, which would have larger implications for them. And confidentiality. You know, a lot of them said it is embarrassing to admit that you're addicted to something. These are some other desired characteristics of a quit vaping program. Use of technology was a big deal to some of them. Kids dislike phone calls. They do not want to talk to you on the phone, but they were happy to talk to you via texting and using some of these programs, although some still liked face-to-face interventions. So again, I'm re-emphasizing this. We really need larger, well-powered clinical trials of behavioral pharmacological interventions for youth and young adults. And I think we need to do some of the kind of work that I showed you in this talk to set the stage for how you would move forward to developing interventions for all these different products. And my last plug is, I think any clinical trials that people do should really incorporate the work group recommendations that SRNT has for adolescent trials. The initial paper was read by Robin, and there are some very specific guidelines provided here for how to conduct a clinical trial and for what to do in terms of getting good outcomes, and that paper has been updated, and Megan Piper is the primary author on that. So please consider using this when you're designing your trials, and I hope we can come together as a community and develop better interventions for youth.
Okay, I'm going to sort of wrap up with some more conceptual thoughts about where do we go next. And so I should have probably started earlier, but these are my disclosures, which I have funding from several different grants from NIH and no other financial disclosures to report. Oh, you know what? We have the wrong slides in here. Oh, well, here, that's okay. The channel went to it somehow. Hopefully we'll have the rest of my slides will be okay. So I'm going to just briefly summarize where we are at from what we've talked about so far today. We have great progress in reducing combustible tobacco rates, but what we haven't actually talked about, and that's important to know, is the progress has not been evenly distributed across the subgroups of adolescents. That there are some subgroups of kids who have not shown the progress in reducing combustible tobacco use. Those tend to be youth who have comorbidities, either other substance use, other psychiatric comorbidities. Youth in sexual minority groups have much higher rates of continuing to use combustible products. Kids who have lower educational aspirations and achievements, kids who have substantial economic disadvantage, and even a lot of our youth in juvenile justice systems to think about that. Oh, this is, let's hopefully.
Oh, how did your slides get mixed up?
I don't know. I hope this is the right file that I put in there. So if not, I'm going to have to wing this. This may not be the right file then. We know that tobacco use is a complex behavior, that a lot of high school kids use any tobacco product, but unfortunately it's the only substance that's used among youth. What we know from other data are alcohol and marijuana is overwhelmingly the norm among youth ever tobacco users and current users. And in a recent study that just came out from 2017 data, that 93% of high school e-cigarette users are also using alcohol and cannabis. So given that e-cigarette is the most prevalent tobacco use and 93% of them are using alcohol and cannabis as well, that changes, I think, the picture quite a lot. We've talked that youth are showing symptoms and signs of dependence even at low rates of use. And we know that even though those are just one or two symptoms, like reporting craving or using when you first come up, that longitudinally starting to show even low levels of symptoms makes a difference, and that we need to pay attention to those low levels because they are signals for kids who escalate, and that's really what we want to see. I think the other thing we need to move beyond is thinking about, well, there's a magic cut point between someone becoming dependent or not dependent. And we're often worried, well, those kids really aren't dependent, or they are dependent. And we need to not worry so much about, is there a magic cut point or threshold, but rather to realize that dependence is a continuum. And there's a lot of individual variability, and there may not be one magic point at which we can declare somebody as being tobacco dependent. And what that means is there are perhaps opportunities along the road to developing more serious dependent symptoms that we should take advantage of for intervening. And we know that kids want to quit. We've heard this now across multiple data sets. But what we also seem to know is access and availability of evidence-based treatments is very low. Not much that they have, and kids don't know what to do. And as Suchitra emphasized, and this is the quote from the Cochrane review, the most recent, we don't have a lot of success in traditional cessation interventions. So the question is, what do we do? Remember that this is complex, that we shouldn't have necessarily expected the success because we really have not done a good job. We forget that kids are not just young adults, but they're different. They're neither kids, they're not adults, they're not just, chronologically younger, but the whole behavior pattern is quite different, that they tend to use products on often an intermittent basis because there often are environmental constraints, financial constraints of where they get it. So their behavior and their patterns of use may not be as regular as adults. And what we also know is they're still reinforcing, and intermittent reinforcement is really hard to extinguish and to change. So that erratic pattern may be part of why it's a challenge. And we also know that the other substance use can act synergistically in reinforcing the tobacco use and reinforcing the other substance use as well. So we have to remember the synergies between especially cannabis and tobacco and how those might work together to increase dependence and make it more difficult to stop. And then adolescence, there's a lot going on. You don't have the same person in 6 months that you were dealing with 6 months before that. There's just a lot of change in their lives. And so the stability that you have when you work with an adult and try to get them to change the behavior, well, everything is changing really rapidly. It's not just the tobacco products are changing, but the adolescent is changing very fast. So everything's a moving target, and you have to be adaptive and think about that. So here comes now the more conceptual. Let's think about this. What should be the target of our interventions? It was really easy, I'm saying in quotes, when we just had to worry about cigarettes. We knew we had a clear outcome that we wanted kids to stop smoking cigarettes completely. All right, so now what do we care about? What should be our outcome? Should it be total combustible tobacco use? That's the real deadly one that we're worried about. Should it be all tobacco products? Should that be what our interventions are focusing on? What about nicotine use? So people are more worried now. You hear that they're really worried about, well, there's adolescent developing brain. Maybe it's just nicotine that we want to get rid of. I mean, is that what we care about? We don't know. Or is it this polysubstance use? Is that what we should think about for the target of our intervention? And then is it only absolute abstinence? What about this continuum of harm? What's the right outcome that we should do? I'm not giving you the answers to any of these. I'm posing these as questions that are ones we really have to grapple with and that we have to think through, I think, as a field and a society for how do we maximize the health benefits? And this is important in thinking through our trials. And one message is, are adolescent tobacco users better conceptualized as substance users? That's what seems to be happening. Should we focus on more comprehensive approaches that address the multiple substances if they're working with each other and reinforcing, rather than and thinking about what are the underlying common determinants? And maybe we need to refocus and reframe what we're doing with the adolescents. So when do we intervene? That's the other big question. We're really good, I think, at prevention efforts. And a lot of the prevention efforts, you heard all those messages from the FDA that are there. They're really geared about trying to get kids to prevent them from using. Messages are really good about persuading, changing social norms. So messages are really good at changing intentions whether it's never to use or intentions to stop using. They're good about giving support and changing the norms. But messages aren't as effective at changing a behavior per se, because people often need skills and some other ways of moving around. Messages are critical, but we need to do more. Now, traditional cessation efforts have dealt with that small percentage of people who we worried about met all of our clinical criteria for inclusion in our RCTs, and the reach is really small. So maybe there's some opportunity here between those early prevention and the cessation that we need to think about, because there's a lag time, and maybe that's where our power should be. So I want to introduce a concept that Andrea Vellante and colleagues have introduced recently, which is this notion that maybe what we need to think about are different targets for intervention, and that pre-escalation may mean that we think differently about how do you interrupt these transitions from initial use to regular use. That the concept of pre-escalation is that we are preventing kids from escalating. That a large number of kids have tried, but it doesn't mean they have to keep trying and progress. That maybe we have some better opportunities for combining prevention and cessation efforts that can be both at a broader reach, that may have more power before regular use gets really entrenched. And that may get the middle of the distribution. That gives us a better arm. So to think about it, it combines both the clinical approach and the population health approach, which is both there. It's sort of thinking about, rather than just intensive work on only individuals, which we see in the clinical approach, a population health perspective focuses attention elsewhere on thinking about what are those underlying causes. Maybe they're social norms, maybe they're the messages, maybe they're the environment that's promoting it, as well as some other social and individual determinants in terms of how kids cope with stress and change, and pre-escalation can use both. So what do that mean? So when you think about pre-escalation, it means understand better the target population. Suchitra did a wonderful job of explaining what some of the motives are and the issues, and to think about what those determinants are in adolescent. What we also need to think about is why kids first try is not necessarily why they're escalating, or why they continue to try, and then what maintains it. There are unique determinants. So this is definitely not a one size, one message hits every part of that uptake continuum. So why is somebody continuing to try? Again, there are the opportunities, the social pressure, but that buzz feeling and that pleasure is kicking in, and thinking about alternatives. So those are the leverage points we have to intervene on. And how do we scale up? So there's the technology, there's alternative approaches that have better reach. And then how do we know if we're being effective? This is where we have to think about what are those intermediate markers besides just abstinence at the end. So pre-escalation gives us an opportunity to reach multiple levels as targets. So we can think about how do we coordinate efforts across sectors. Again, we're thinking large population health now. So that means let's engage schools. Let's engage venues that we see kids, the healthcare settings, the sectors, sports venues, other opportunities. Use social media to actually deliver some social normative information, but then pull in organizational structures that may reach high-risk youth. That means even going to the juvenile justice system. Substance use screens can be part of different ways of sports and schools, community groups. And I'm going to put in a plug for families and parents. Kids don't necessarily want parents, but parents often do know. And parents don't know what to do. They don't know if what their behavior is helpful or just promoting their kids being more upset and using the substances to cope. Parents would love to know, what do they do? What should they do? What do they say to their kids? What are their options? So even though the kids want the confidentiality, may not want the parents, it doesn't mean that parents aren't a useful leverage point, and to think about what we can do for them. Peers are also a useful leverage point, thinking about peer-to-peer interventions, and then of course engaging the youth themselves. There is no doubt that nicotine is reinforcing. And that is a fundamental issue that we have to think about, is how do we change the value of that reinforcement for kids. And so we may need to think about how do we scale up what might be some promising, what I'll call value-based decision-making interventions. So what you want are interventions that can help you flip the value of not using against this really immediate good sensation and pleasure and buzz and coping mechanism that kids use with nicotine and substances. So what are the substance-free choices that we can promote more for kids? How do we make those costs more salient, the immediate costs? The kids aren't really worried about, are they going to get the heart attack or develop cancer? That's well in the future. The immediate cost might be that they're not running as fast, or that they're missing out on some fun thing because they're in the bathroom sucking away on the Juul or doing things. So what are the immediate costs and the social costs? And then how do we facilitate those change? So I'm going to just throw out a couple of ideas to think about, one of which are some new, more novel kinds of interventions, one of which is called episodic future thinking. So here's an example of episodic future thinking. You're thinking about some point in the future that is near, that is a really positive event to overcome some of the negative kinds of things that might be happening now and changing the value. We can all engage in episodic future thinking right now. Imagine a year from now, we're all in Baltimore at the 2021 SRNT, having a wonderful time going out with whoever we want to go out with in a packed audience and conveying our, and it's an achievable, realistic goal to get us through just, any disappointment at this. Really, this is no disappointment here. You're all doing good. But the self-affirmation of congratulating everyone for coming and being here and being part of this event. Youth can do the same things, because essentially what we know about substance users and nicotine in kids is this, this notion of delay discounting. They discount these future gains for the immediate. Well, you make immediate gains. Are you going to wreck your prom because you're stuck with the girls in the girls' room using instead of out with your boyfriend dancing? Are you going to, wreck your chances of doing a good job on your college interview because you're too worried and nervous because of your Juul addiction? Those are immediate costs. And so imagine that you're having fun, navigating, and successful in a new you without it. That's the flip, and being able to help kids imagine and do that. And these can be implemented remotely. Contingency management. Actually with kids, this is promising. Suchitra's done a lot of this work. But we don't have to worry about monetary rewards. It's not that we're going to just pay kids. There are other contingencies we can change. And this means perhaps engaging parents and schools and other systems, because there are important contingencies and rewards for kids organizationally and in schools that may matter and that we can think about. So it's just, being creative and organizing multiple levels of intervening to have a broader-based impact. We also, though, need to think in order for pre-escalation to work, it means we actually have to detect something early enough. So perhaps that means reducing the stigma, finding opportunities to just identify kids for when they're using at really low levels. That's our challenge. We can identify the ones who are addicted, actually. It's the low-level escalators that we want a little bit more tuned into. And actually, parents are a vehicle. If parents know how to engage in a discussion with their kids, have you ever tried this? I'm curious, most kids are trying. Have you tried? Or, other people where there's a reduced stigma of learning how to screen and identify. And what are the questions, so that we know then how to do a more just-in-time intervention as an opportunity. And then we need to think about how we're going to evaluate. So, my most provocative question is, can we tolerate, recreational nicotine use, as we seem to be starting to tolerate recreational marijuana use, or no? And we have to be clear about some of these messages to kids. What's the difference? Kids want to know. They're using both together. Does that mean I can use one substance and not the other? We have to have some good dialogue and be clear in our messages with kids. Where does nicotine replacement therapy fit in? If we're telling them nicotine's not good and then we're giving them nicotine replacement therapy, or is it that vaping? What's our message? What do we want? And we need to be clear about what some of this guidance is. Kids pick up on our confusion, and that's not good. We're confused. We don't really know. But we need to think these through, and I think that's what the whole notion here is for us to start to tackle these challenges. How do we design for maximum impact, for reach and efficacy? And I'll argue for doing pragmatic trials, not just our rigorous RCTs, rigorous pragmatic trials. Don't worry about screening in for all kinds of screening out. All comers, people who want to be who are willing to sign up, let's take them, because there are multiple points along the continuum that we can intervene with. So the take-home points. Tobacco use is complex, we knew that coming in. But let's think about, is this just now a substance use problem, and how do we really deal with the totality? Because we can't ignore that anymore. When do we time our interventions? There are lots of opportunities. And how do we engage multiple sectors? So finally, don't neglect these really high risks. Suzanne would be really upset if we forgot to end with that, because her passion has always been trying to get the kids who are really suffering from the disparities and our high risk groups. So I think with that, we're going to open up for questions. And
So any questions, please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Jenny Pearson. I'm at the University of Nevada, Reno. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. As someone who lives in a cannabis recreational state since July 2017, I very much appreciate you bringing up cannabis, both as, we need to think about it as a polysubstance along with alcohol and nicotine. But then also vaping cannabis, I feel like a broken record right now. Mm-hmm. But we really, those of you who live in cannabis legal states, please go to a dispensary. Just start talking to people. Because, I, for example, have never seen a cannabis vaping product that you actually need to modify. That it's the same thing, right? So you can go to a dispensary and buy a cartomizer that's sealed, that's 510 threaded, that you can go home and unscrew your tank that has the nicotine solution in it and screw in your cartomizer and go to town. It's exactly the same product. And so I really want us to start thinking, when we say vape to people and when we say e-cigarette, they don't necessarily think nicotine. And in fact, I am doing focus groups with youth in Nevada right now, and when we talk about vaping or e-cigarettes, they go directly to cannabis. They do not stop at nicotine. It's not a salient discussion for them. So I also want to bring up, too, that at least in Nevada, and I imagine also in California, products that are heat not burn, people are also referring to as vapes. Yeah. So, the Pax Plume, for example, that does not look all that different from a typical kind of larger e-cig mod. People are calling that vape. And so, another part of my life, I'm also obsessed with measurement. And so now these two things are coming together, and I'm becoming an evangelist for cannabis vaping. So that's just, I want to throw that out there to our small but, hearty group here.
No, you raise a very good point, Jennifer. I think that has been one of the biggest problems with the whole vaping field, which is that we are all struggling with measurement issues. And I get calls every day from people, and I call people every day saying, here's a new product, how are you measuring this now? So I think this is a big concern, and I don't know that any of us have the answer to this, because it's so constantly evolving. So I think you just have to ask everything you can and hope you come up with a solution.
Well, I think the answer is we need to expand our vision and recognize that vape is just a syringe and the drug could be any number of
It could, absolutely.
Question there.
Sorry.
My name is Lauren Saplicki. I'm with Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations and for the excellent questions that you've raised, and it's a lot to think about. But one thing that I did kind of want to pose back is, how can we be more intentional about including an equity lens when we're thinking through the design of these interventions? I think the steps that you've laid out are all there, but there might be subgroups where one size does not fit all, and we really need to think about how products are being used together and differently in different groups of youth and young adults. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think those are very true. I think that they are used differently by different subgroups, and they serve different functional values in those, and I think that's part of understanding the tailoring. One of those things are going to where the kids are and identifying and intervening, and doing Suchitra presented wonderful focus group, understanding what their motives are, and that tailoring is needed.
Yeah, I would also add that, one of the other things is we need different kinds of interventions too. Mm-hmm. As you said, one intervention is not going to work for everybody, because people are in so many different stages of, they're just initiating or they've just used and they've not really become dependent. So I think every intervention has a place, in including prevention interventions, including interventions focused on cessation. So, we need more, not just one focused intervention.
Martin Dockland from Public Health England. Can I first just add to Jennifer's thanks, because you guys have done such a great job in doing these presentations. It's so engaging. I think you've invented a new way of doing these seminars. You also illustrated really well how hard it is to help kids to quit. But I think it's even harder to help kids stay quit and preventing relapse. Yeah. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and whether there were maybe population measures which might be useful to perhaps countering some of the tobacco industry's techniques for triggering relapse. I don't know, point of sale display bans, or standard packaging the way we have in some countries.
So I agree that getting kids and getting anyone to stay quit is very challenging. And one of the things that you can do with kids is know what are some life developmental transition points and use those to your advantage, because each of those provide opportunities for kids to be reflective or to start new, and as good leverage and check-in points. So whether, at least here in the US, it's graduating from high school or getting your driver's license, graduating from high school, moving on, there are opportunities of refreshing, and where kids can reinvent and reaffirm and use those. And so just programming in the fact that you can't, it's not one shot, you're over. We know that doesn't happen. So figuring out how to engage and stay engaged for the long term is really important.
The other thing also is, the reason I put that last slide on there about thinking about how to measure outcomes is another measurement issue, right? It's huge. We can't use the kind of traditional outcomes we use with adults, like measuring, 3-month cessation or 6-month cessation. Maybe we need to be more creative about how we think about this. The program should be something that should be available on an ongoing basis. So you quit, then you lapse or relapse, do it again. The intervention's available for you. And it's really about seeing them through this high-risk period with whatever we can provide for them. So I think we need to measurement issues become important there also. Using the more traditional measures, and Robin's written a lot on this, may not be a good idea.
Question.
Hi, Darlene Brunzell, Virginia Commonwealth University. Thanks both for a great session, and a huge public health concern if these kids continue to use these tobacco products. I was just thinking about what we know from the animal literature, and nicotine's really interesting because not only is it reinforcing on its own, but it can actually enhance the reinforcing effects of other things. And so with rats, that can be a light or a tone. And so nicotine can make animals just switch levers to turn lights and tones on and off. And I think that's really interesting when we look at kids with the vaping, particularly with the flavors. and that nicotine can actually enhance that those flavors. I wonder if that's true in kids like it is in rats. I think that would be important to note. And also, I just wondered if you'd given any thought. And so nested in that is a question: is there sort of flavor loyalty or brand loyalty from these kids? And then the other question is: have you thought at all about trying to dissociate these cues with the vape use? Because I think that's why it has become so pervasive. They can do it anywhere. These cues are everywhere. They go into the bathroom and they want to vape because that's where they vaped before. And so have you given any thought to dissociating these different contextual cues from the vape?
Do you want to talk about the flavors first? Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry.
So
really.
flavors, yes. So absolutely. So one of the things we have done is also experimental studies around flavors, and it's very clear that that flavors have various sensory effects that can actually counteract some of the sensory effects you get from nicotine. So we have some very clear evidence that flavors like menthol, for example, definitely, even though it was hypothetically out there, but our data shows that it definitely reduces irritation from cigarettes and makes people use more. So there is that data out there. So there's definitely a relationship between using flavors and using nicotine. It may not be exactly what you're seeing in animals, because I know your models are so complex and you're really looking at flavor and nicotine rewarding behavior. But NIADI, did some work showing that just flavor exposure itself activates the brain reward circuitry. So I would, in animals, so I would anticipate that you're definitely going to see similar kinds of interactions. Harder to measure in human youth, to break it down the way you can in animals. So that's where we are today. But there's definitely a huge interaction in terms of going in the way or in the direction of what you're seeing with the animal work. And your second question, I'm sorry, I forgot.
About divorcing all the different aspects of it. And, well, there are multiple parts of that. And I think, for example, if, just to take the example of like nicotine replacement therapy, that's sort of divorced a lot of the other components in getting somebody off that. Or if you had reduced nicotine levels within some of the products, that would be one way of sort of separating. But it's very pervasive, and we'll see with new regulations coming in just how the products may be changing, and if they become, if there are more restrictions on some of those varieties, which may play a role.
Thanks.
Yeah, schools are trying very hard, but they're not being very successful. Sorry, there's a question there? Yes.
Hi, I'm Asma from University of York. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I was wondering about the mass media exposure of tobacco and its impact on the adolescents. So what's your view on that, and can we be that creative to have intervention developed based on the mass media to work for it? Thank you.
Yeah, there is no doubt that messages in the mass media and images have played a huge role in the uptake and the spread of some of the tobacco use. And there's also no doubt that mass media could be converted to give the opposite message and be an influence of change. And I think good examples with the Truth Campaign of really how they have done a fabulous job of understanding and changing some media-based messages and countering, and certainly some of the FDA campaigns as well. So yes, needing to put a lot of effort in there changes the norms and the environment, which sets the stage for people to be able to quit.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is the social media question that I asked the FDA, because I think the problem with youth is even small amounts of advertisement that's put out there is just taken over by social media, and it's tweeted, it's retweeted, it's there are videos made on it, and that's how it spreads. So we are dealing with a very different climate today, where it's not the kind of more traditional advertising avenues which are working to help spread. It's this social media climate, and I don't think we know how to handle that yet. They're doing a lot of work on putting anti-use messages on social media, but you still have what are they called? All these very popular people.
Social influencers.
Thank you, social influencers who are, Snoop Dogg is selling burgers at the same time that he's selling marijuana vape pens. So, and kids love that kind of stuff, and they're following these social influencers on social media, which is hard to counteract.
Yeah. All right, Andrea, you get the last question.
Thank you. Andrea King, University of Chicago. Fabulous presentations. I guess I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about where do you see schools going in terms of this issue? So I have very little experience with this, but when my daughter came home from middle school and said it was like the gym teacher is usually the person delivering these messages of prevention. And some of the misinformation, I took it upon myself, and now I do presentations. But they're often one-offs. It seems like high-performing schools, in my opinion, they're worried about SAT, ACT scores, and internalizing disorders, anxiety, depression. And it seems like schools that are more urban or lower income are worried about graduation rates and violence. And so they have so many things they're working on. I feel like, I don't know where you feel like this is going in terms of their radar. And God, they would have such an important role in prevention and education, but they, in my opinion, don't really quite hit the mark. And I want to know what you guys think.
Oh, I think it's very much on schools' radars. Very much on it. I think that, not to let a good crisis go, but the EVALI crisis really, really ramped up schools' interest and parents' interest. And parents are very concerned now. So I think it's very much on the radar of schools. That said, they don't know what to do. And what we don't want to see repeated is what we saw, a couple of decades ago with cessation, where you suddenly get mandatory punishments, but no real good treatments or approaches for doing it. But schools are interested, they need guidance.
Yeah. Andrea, the only thing I would add to that is, I think we need to find a way of making vaping for kids as abhorrent as cigarette smoking is. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we can do it in this current climate, because I think as a society, even within here, we still haven't solved this issue of vaping and how we are going to present it to society, and we are as confused about it as everybody else is. So kids are seeing mixed messages. Until we get to that point where we can tell kids, vaping is really bad for you and you should not be doing it, and you kind of make it socially unacceptable to do, I don't know that we're going to see huge decreases in some of these rates. So, but I don't know how to do that right now.
Can I do one follow-up? At level of a parent, I almost see the parents who are completely helpless and like, so-and-so vapes, I don't know what to say because I don't get it. Or I see the kind of more dominant parent who they just talk, and they don't listen. And I didn't know the research where this is going in terms of parent training or how to help them with communication skills.
It is a neglected area, one I've often been passionate about, though, of developing. It's a very neglected area and one that's ripe for research and intervention. So I'd encourage people to invest in that.
Thank you.
Gideon Helen, UCSF. So, how do you make vaping abhorrent to kids?
It's a very good question. That's why I said I don't have an answer.
Let me finish. So, how do you make it abhorrent to kids and also make it as a possible harm reduction for adults? Can you do the two?
Very good question, Gideon. I hope you had an answer to that, but I don't. That's why I said I do not have an answer to that question. What I know is what worked to reduce cigarette smoking rates is the fact that kids just don't like, it's not socially acceptable to smoke cigarettes. And that is what really worked in reducing cigarette smoking rates for young adults, for youth. I don't know how to do that. I believe in harm reduction. I think there is a role for e-cigarettes in harm reduction, but I don't know how to do that. So I'm as confused as you are. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Or anybody else in the room.
So good discussion for our continued discussion upstairs for the reception.
Yes.
And thank you all for hanging in here and